is in that piece, to me, I talk about the adjective indigenous. Firstly, you know, I'm interested by the fact that this is a word that you find really only in the adjectival sense. So that may seem like a sort of a banal point, but it does kind of make you think about what it means. What does it mean to have an adjective that really has no noun attached? To me, it means it works because of the way that indigenous is always placed almost in binary opposition with the West or Western. So it really comes from that kind of reified binary, indigenous versus Western. And a couple other points that I make in that editorial concerning the word indigenous, I refer to it as a placeholder, which is, you know, it's a concept from basic maths, and it's intended. What I mean by that is it stands in place of an identity name, because the reality is that we all of us in the world identify ourselves using various, you know, aspects of our identity. When we identify ourselves, our ethnicity, I would never refer to myself by ethnicity as indigenous. I would only refer to myself as indigenous if I was, I don't know, in some different kind of way, because I identify as Māori, right? And Māori are recognised as the indigenous peoples of Aotearoa. So my identity is not indigenous per se. And that's the sense in which I talk about the adjective indigenous as a placeholder. It's a kind of a category group. Lots of other identity and ethnicity terms work the same way, of course. This is not something that's unique. But I think it's an important point when we start to think about what are the kinds of things that the adjective indigenous is applied to. So we can, you know, we often hear about indigenous knowledge, for example. That's a very active, very important kind of worldwide discussion. And as you know, PISA and EPAT have made lots of efforts. You know, I think about the special issue by Michael Peters and Carl Micker, talking about the dilemma of Western philosophy and the sort of dead end to which Western philosophy has brought itself, and the idea that non-Western philosophies, including indigenous philosophies, may provide some kind of way out, I suppose, if there is a dead end. It's obviously still under debate. And the other thing that I discuss in the article, a sort of a linguistic point, if you like, is the capitalization or not of indigenous. And I noticed that particularly in the international literature from North America, where indigenous matters are discussed frequently, there's very much a tendency to capitalize indigenous but decapitalize Western. And I tend to see that round the wrong way. Because indigenous is a placeholder and not a label of identity, it makes sense to me to use a small I. However, I do find myself falling in line with the editorial policies of the publication venues where I publish. So it's not a big deal to me if it's a big I or a little I. But it's interesting when you look at the way that the word Western or West is often decapitalized. And the only times that I've seen that explained has been almost a sort of attempt to, shall we say, cast aspersions or sort of de-emphasize or, I don't really know what words to use here, but it's as if by decapitalizing the word Western, the author is trying to make it seem less important or whatever. But in my view, that's wrong too, because by decapitalizing that notion of Western, it kind of normalizes it in the text. So I myself, in my own scholarly writing practice, just choose to capitalize those terms, Western, when they're being used to refer to identity or knowledge, culture, and those sorts of things, philosophies. And that brings me to the last thing that I think I've got to say about this little paper at the moment, which is that I think what can become confusing about the concept of Indigenous and the way that we use it and the way that we think with it is when I mean, it can be applied to knowledge. It can also be applied to language. You know, knowledge really subsumes, in my view, language, culture, philosophies, but it can also be applied to people. And that's where I think sometimes non-Indigenous people can inadvertently homogenize the people that they may be thinking about. Because if Indigenous is an umbrella category, so Indigenous knowledge is clearly not one unitary thing, right? We understand Indigenous knowledge as a sort of an umbrella term for a whole range of diverse knowledges of Indigenous peoples around the world. That's fine. But when we start lumping people into those kinds of umbrella categories, then I think we can very easily cause kind of interrelational difficulties. So in my own work, I don't refer to myself as Indigenous. I refer to myself as Māori. That for me seems like a home ground, a solid kind of base on which I can stand. And that's really all I have to say about that at the moment.